Welcome. Committee will come to order. Committee on the Budget's hearing today on the Congressional Budget Office's Budget and Economic Outlook will commence. We will hear testimony from Director Swagel of the Congressional Budget Office. Welcome, Dr. Swagel. I would now like to yield myself such time as I may consume. We're talking about FISA this week, which is an issue of national security. And I want to quote Admiral Mullen's comment at a hearing, a defense hearing, where when asked what the biggest threat to national security was, his response was, the biggest threat to national security is our national debt. Jerome Powell, the Fed chairman, who probably is loath to opine on fiscal policy, in a 60 Minutes interview said, the national debt, our fiscal path, is completely unsustainable, and it's an urgent matter that we must address. I think that's significant, and that's some backdrop to the budget baseline update from February. Most recently was in May of 23, and then this recent update here in February. Bottom line is, on Valentine's Day, when we think about how much we love our significant others, one could ask, how much do we love the country? How much do we love our children's future in the country? Well, as Shakespeare said, let me count the ways. Maybe the ways we're not loving our country well. $20 trillion in additional debt over the next 10 years, from 34 trillion, record high, to 54 trillion. Clearly, the mandatory spending is driving this. Demographics, but also inflation. Inflation is significant. We'll dig into that. That's because of the COLAs, the cost of living adjustments. In these entitlement programs, we're spending a lot more money. Not to mention the 10,000 baby boomers retiring a day. That adds to this unsustainable fiscal path. Interest cost. Interest rates are recently in record highs, and the interest expense on the debt is exploding. In fact, the revision from May to February, in just months, was $125 billion in additional cost to service the debt. That's more than the Homeland Security Department. That's more than the budget of commerce and education. The debt, or the interest on the debt, rather, is now higher than we spend on all of national defense, if the $870 billion projections come true. Some project it'll be upwards of $1 trillion. Of the $20 trillion in additional debt, because of the current policies and programs of the federal government, we're going to see over 60% of all of that cost in interest alone. Not anything to address the solvency of our senior safety nets, not anything to help ensure our soldiers and sailors are safe and successful in the most important job to provide a common defense, not a dollar or a dime to infrastructure, just paying China, Japan, and other bondholders of U.S. Treasuries because of our massive deficit spending and debt appetite, which was $1.7 trillion, the annual deficit, last year, which is more than the entire deficit, the discretionary budget that we're fighting over, and often between my own party. So there is great concern, and yet there's a silver lining in your report. I'm anxious to hear more about it, Dr. Swagel. You mentioned that one bright spot is that the deficit spending has actually gone down year over year in the short run. It's eclipsed by the growth in mandatory and interest in the 10-year, but year over year, deficit spending goes down because Republicans decided to use basically the action-forcing mechanism and moment of the debt ceiling to bring my Democrat colleagues to the table and negotiate a spending cap deal. That FRA spending cap deal that was bipartisan, that we passed and the president signed into law, will save $1.6 trillion over 10 years. So as Moody's and Fitch mentioned in their report, as they downgraded our credit rating and our outlook, we need to do more FRA deals that reduce spending, but we need to focus on mandatory programs. And by the way, in 10 years, mandatory spending, or that spending which is on autopilot, goes from under 75% of the total budget of the United States to 80% or 79%, almost 80% of the entire budget. So we have a bipartisan fiscal commission, Dr. Swagel, that would focus on the long-term unfunded liabilities, that would address what Fitch and Moody's suggested, that we have a long-term plan, and that we have both parties at the table to address it. If we could keep doing the FRA, modest improvements on the controlling spending on discretionary and get serious about reining in this runaway spending on the mandatory side, we might save this country. We might give Jerome Powell something to be more confident and sanguine about with respect to America's fiscal future. Again, thanks for coming. We appreciate your time and insights. And with that, I yield to my ranking member for as much time as he may consume.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome back, Dr. Swagel. There is no debate, none whatsoever. America's economy is the strongest in the world and the envy of other developed nations. No economy on earth has recovered more quickly and more strongly than that of the American economy. Here are the facts to back that up. There have been just under 15 million jobs created since President Biden took office. In fact, we may very well hit the 15 million mark next month. That's more jobs created in this presidential term than any other previous term in history. The 3-month average job growth is 289,000 jobs a month. The unemployment rate at 3.7% has now been under 4% for the last 2 years. Historic. This economy now has, to those who spread the false claim that we're just regaining the jobs lost during COVID, consider this fact. The economy today has 5.4 million more jobs than before COVID. In 2023, GDP growth was 2.5% year over year. And on inflation, which has ravaged every single economy on earth as we came back from COVID, inflation here in the United States has fallen from the peak of 9% last summer to now only 3%. And finally, consumer confidence, which was one area that was until recently lagging, consumer confidence has turned around and now hit a 2-year high. None of this was achieved by accident. It happened because when our nation was struggling, Democrats in this administration worked together to take action to rescue our economy, invest in working families, rebuild our infrastructure, and bring manufacturing back to America. So let's make sure as we move forward, we don't do anything that risks these historic economic gains. Now, transitioning, Dr. Swagel, to what we will hear from you in terms of next year's projection and perhaps longer term than next year. We do, of course, in the long term, have our challenges. Every single nation in Western civilization is having to deal with the fact that our population, or I should say the percentage of those who are older, is increasing. And that does put certain fiscal demands on our entitlement programs. But I remind people who sometimes forget, when we say entitlements, these are earned benefits. Social Security, Medicare, these are programs that workers paid into over a lifetime of work. As we are looking to address in the long term the challenges we have with both trust funds, we must do nothing whatsoever that would imperil those programs or push through devastating cuts that are absolutely unwarranted and unjustified. So, Dr. Swagel, I will, many more things I could say on this topic, but I will pause there, and I look forward to hearing from your testimony. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Boyle. In the interest of time, and if any other member has an opening statement, I ask you submit it for the record. I'll hold the record open to the end of the day to accommodate those members who may not have prepared written statements. I'd like to recognize Director Swagel now and thank him again for his time and yield the floor to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member Boyle, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify about the budget and economic outlook. I'll talk first about the federal budget and then briefly discuss the economy. In the budget projections we released last week, the deficit grows to $2.6 trillion in 2034. Measured in relation to economic output, deficits during the coming decade are about 50% larger than their historical average over the past 50 years. Net interest costs are a major contributor to the deficit, and their growth is equal to about 3/4 of the increase in the deficit from 2024 to 2034. By the end of that 10-year period, net interest costs are roughly 1.5 times larger than either defense or non-defense discretionary spending. Now, also boosting deficits are two familiar underlying trends: the aging of the population and growth in federal health care costs per beneficiary. Those trends put upward pressure on mandatory spending. Measured in relation to economic output, federal debt held by the public rises from 99% in 2024 to 116% in 2034, surpassing its historical peak. Debt continues to rise, reaching 172% of GDP 30 years out. From 2024 to 2033, the deficit is about 7% smaller than we projected last year, primarily as a result of the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023 and the subsequent continuing resolutions. Together, those laws reduce the growth of discretionary spending, including the effects on debt service. Legislative changes in total reduce deficits by $2.6 trillion over the next 10 years. That's all the legislative changes. In our projections, the deficit is also smaller than it was last year because economic output is greater, partly as a result of more people working. The labor force in 2033 is larger by 5.2 million people, mostly because of higher net immigration. As a result of those changes in the labor force, we estimate that from 2023 to 2034, GDP will be about $7 trillion larger, and revenues will be higher by about $1 trillion than would have been otherwise. Now, immigration is also associated with increased spending and with many other effects, and we are continuing to assess the implications of immigration for revenues and for spending. So two key factors partially offset the deficit reduction compared to last year's projections. The first is that net interest costs rise as a result of higher interest rates. And then second is that the cost of the energy-related tax provisions are much higher than the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation originally projected. And those costs reflect new emission standards, market developments, and actions taken by the administration to implement the tax provisions. Our next update to these budget projections will come this spring and will incorporate the actual data about 2023 budget outcomes that typically accompany the release of the president's budget, as well as other new information, including about any new rules, any new administrative actions that have come into place since early January when we finalized the projections we're discussing today. To keep you informed on a regular basis about the status of the deficit, we issue the monthly budget review showing federal spending and revenue totals for the previous month and the fiscal year to date. Let me briefly turn to the economic projections. The U.S. economy grew faster in 2023 than it did in 2022, even as inflation slowed. We do see economic growth slowing in 2024 with slightly higher unemployment and continued lower inflation. We expect the Federal Reserve, to eventually respond by reducing interest rates starting around the middle of the calendar year. Since February 2023, when we last published our full economic forecast, we have lowered our projections of economic growth and inflation for this year, in part because last year was so strong. We expect interest rates to be a bit higher over the next couple of years than we projected last year, but then after 2027, our projections are generally similar to what we had before. Let me stop there, and I'm happy to be here and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Swagel. We'll now begin with the question and answer session. I'll give myself 5 minutes. So when I think about what's happening with the cost of living in this country, I see it as an imbalance between supply and demand. And I just want to make sure as an economist, you understand it the same way. We had an administration and policies of this administration that squeezed supply with higher taxes, with higher and more regulations, higher cost, and with paying people more than they made in their previous job for a long time, which created a labor shortage. We still have a lower job participation rate than we did prior to COVID. That's the supply side squeeze. On the demand, overstimulating demand, we flooded the market with federal money. Started with $1 trillion in so-called COVID relief. We had $1 trillion from prior COVID relief unspent. The IRA was supposed to be deficit reducing, or at least pay for itself. Now I think your update is that it will cost $300 billion in additional deficit spending. And the total debt, new debt since this president's been in office, is $6 trillion. So you've got squeeze in demand, in supply, and overstimulated demand. You have record 40-year inflation. Is that how you see it? And is that an accurate depiction of what has brought us to the recent inflationary environment?
Right. No, that's consistent with the way we've looked at inflation, is that imbalance between demand and the supply constraints.
Is inflation causing an increase in mandatory spending because earned benefit programs and other mandatory spending programs are going up because there's a COLA or an index for cost of living, and that's causing tens of billions of dollars in increased cost to the taxpayers and in our budget forecast?
Yes, that's right. Inflation plays out into the mandatory spending and then also into the interest costs. This higher inflation translates into higher interest rates.
Why are interests going up? Are interests going up to try to tamp down on inflation by causing growth to recede so that we can cool off this cost of living crisis? Aren't interest hikes directly related to inflation, which I would submit are directly related to the overspending and the squeezing of the supply side? Is that a fair characterization?
No, I think that's right, that the Fed responded to the high interest rates by taking action to high inflation by taking action to raise interest rates.
I try to be careful not to blame the president for everything or my Democrat colleagues for everything, but I think their failed economic policies and their unbridled spending has put us in a situation where we have to bring these costs down. Let's talk about the interest for a minute. Prior to President Biden taking office, your projections over the 10 years for interest expense related to servicing the debt was about $4.5 trillion. Today, it's over $12 trillion. I think that the interest cost for the year the president took office was about $340 billion. Today, your new projection is, as I said, higher than the expense of the national defense of the greatest country and military in the world, $870 billion. Is that a fair depiction of our balance sheet and some of these factors?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That, as you said, interest costs are now above defense spending.
So Republicans were much maligned for pushing back on the debt ceiling. It was, to me, a flashing red light, if not yellow, saying your debt is now at the highest levels, debt to GDP, The path is unsustainable. The unfunded liability, 30 years out, 120 trillion. And we were accused of being reckless for saying, wait a minute, we have an opportunity to have a conversation. Republicans led the debt ceiling negotiations. As a result, we got the FRA deal. Some of us, including me, thought it should be more aggressive at reducing spending on the discretionary side. But regardless, the bipartisan outcome was a reset of the baseline and slower growth in discretionary, saving $1.6 trillion. Is that a fair characterization?
Right, and that's what you see in our projections. The change in the deficit, the lower deficit, is coming from those legislative actions.
Well, my time